the lights down as well? Can you see that? Yeah. Can you hear me, most importantly? Yeah. Good, great. Okay, I'm going to begin with this, which I don't think you are going to be able to see. You sit at the back. Which is one of my favourite things that we did with Mick, which I think one person in the audience may remember, which was an interview which was unpublished while we were at Shapwick, in which students asked Mick about his favourite activities and things he was interested in. And I think it's the most revealing document that I have, which tells us a little bit about Mick's personality and his interests, and feeds into some of the material we're hearing about this morning, particularly from Julian. So it starts off with a question about music. What's your favourite music? Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Wagner, and Maria Farenturi. Maria Farenturi is for those of you that don't know her work, is a Greek protest singer, highly politicised, very popular, particularly in the 70s and 80s, but actually played at Carnegie Hall last week, still very much active. His favourite book, to be revealed, The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco. Man for All Seasons remained, I think, always his favourite film. Favourite archaeology book. You may have copies of this at home. Medieval Religious Houses of England and Wales, Knowles and Hancock. This is the kind of Bible which he kept in the car, actually kept in his van. And when he went to visit monastic houses, he would tick them off and write comments in the book. So he used it as a sort of travel guide, if you like, to medieval England. Most disappointing archaeology book, Where Troy Once Stood, author forgotten. And I'm privileged enough to know why Mick didn't like that book. It's because the author decided that Troy was in Norwich. You might be right. Before archaeology, fetus, nearly a ruffian and a social problem. It was always a social problem, I think. Favourite aspect of archaeology, personal things, fingerprint on a pot, preserved footprint. Best archaeological experience, and Julian referred to this, the first time I saw the Bronze Age buildings at Akrotiri on Santorini. If you haven't been to Santorini, you haven't seen that site, that is a pilgrimage that you absolutely have to make. Worst archaeological experience, probably field walking at Shapwick, when the weather's lousy and you just want to go home and get in the bath. There was usually cake, actually, before that, but then there was home and bath. Hobbies, wine, cooking, classical music, garden landscaping. Mick was very keen on hedges and his vegetable plots, which we'll come back to in a moment. Travelling around in my beloved van looking at interesting things. Well, that seems fair enough. Hates injustice, privilege of any sort. I have a pathological loathing of Tories. His words don't lie, there we go. So there's an introduction to the man. Here he is. This is the cover of Mick's Archaeology, and I'm showing you this because in Mick's Archaeology he dedicated a whole chapter to Shapwick and to his interests really in rural settlement, which is the theme of the 3 talks we're going to be hearing this afternoon. And Mick's work on rural settlement, as Julian mentioned, started very early when he was working on the Oxfordshire SMR. Indeed, before that, while he was at university and indeed while he was at school. And he was very proud of that early work. And one of the strange things about this, which you may be surprised to hear, is that Mick often felt that the academic side of his life had been rather ignored by people and perhaps rather overtaken by what had happened with Timeteam in terms of his public face. But he was very proud of the academic contributions that he made, particularly in this sphere of rural settlement. And very pleased, in fact, to find that some of those contributions were rounded up in a recent compilation called Medieval Rural Settlement, which acknowledged that early work and the importance of it, particularly in the southwest of England, in the west of Somerset and in Devon and Cornwall. The archaeology that he was inspired by was the archaeologists he was inspired by included on the right and the bottom here, Gerrard Hurst, Maurice Beresford, both of whom were friends of Mick's, and Philip Rats in the remarkable headgear you can see bottom left there with Chris Dyer and Dave Austin, and the iconic site in the slide here of Warren Percy on the Yorkshire Wolds. And Mick harboured a desire from an early period when he was working at Bristol University to run a big project, one which would last for a number of years, one which would have the same long-lasting influence on archaeology and archaeologists. And the project that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon was perhaps it, and that's Shapwick. All through his time working in Somerset and later at Bristol University, Mick would be up in plains and he would be drawing and sketching the archaeology that he found. He was very much, as Julian explained this morning, actively involved in the southwest. So working in the southwest with this interest in medieval settlements, the sort of GPS points began to come together on a possible project somewhere to the south of Bristol, perhaps. He lectured to me when I was at university, and even in those lectures, when I was, I suppose, 19, 20, he would explain to us what kind of project could be run, what the objectives of it could be, what kind of new information it could deliver. And this is 10 years before Shapwick really kicked off. And I was one of a number of students who would slither around in the back of this French baker's van here, this 2CV, because he used to arrive at lectures and say, look, let's just go out. Let's get in the van. And so we'd all get in the van, and there'd be lots of maps and copies of Knowles and Hadcock and bits of Pevsner, and we'd drive out to archaeology sites, and Mick would explain to us, in some cases explain to us what was going on. In other cases, and I still do this with students of my own, we would arrive at a site and then he would say, right, out, I'm going to come back in an hour, you tell me what this site's about. And we would get out of the vehicle and wander around in a field. There'll be a few lumps and bumps, and we try to sort it out while he disappeared and had a look at something else. And then he would come back and say, right, come on, tell me what you found. Really, really good experience, of course, for learning about field archaeology. And he had Mick a particular mantra about higher education and archaeology, learning of archaeology in universities, which was that everybody who went to university to study archaeology had to have visited a minimum of 50 archaeological sites. And he didn't think you could do archaeology unless you had that kind of experience, that kind of range, which, of course, as we learnt from Julian, he'd had himself when he was at school and later at university when he was working with Philip Rats. And so he gave us that opportunity as students at Bristol to follow in that line and learn something for ourselves. And his lectures, which I've never forgotten, were extremely entertaining, littered with Monty Python tapes and strange slides and stories about his own adventures out there in the archaeological landscape. One of the slides that he showed us when I was at university is this one, which I still use for students of my own, which is a very simple map of England and Wales. Apologies to Scotland at the top there. And it shows this very curious distribution of villages, a sort of spine of villages running from the southwest all the way up to the area that we're in now. And this is the area where what archaeologists refer to as nucleated villages are to be found. Villages which are quite compact, with rows of housing, often with a church, sometimes with a village green. Villages that appear to be planned. Either side of that, in East Anglia, down here in the southeast, and in Wales, and in the northwest, we don't really see very much evidence of that kind of pattern. And what Mick was beginning to focus in on back in, I suppose, the early 1980s, was to find a site within that green strip
which could be investigated over a long time period. And he began to, almost pilot studies, he began to undertake, looking to see what evidence there was for each of about 10 villages. And then finally, he focused in on Shapwick. And Shapwick, he particularly sought out because some work had been done there by Nick Corcus as part of a master's thesis, which Mick examined for Harold Fox. And Nick had been at Leicester University, so Mick had read this piece of work and been inspired by what Nick had written and decided that it would make an interesting choice for a long-term landscape study. This is a postcard sent by James Bond, who we heard about earlier, Mick's great chum, to Mick at Christmas time. Every year, James would send Mick an adulterated Christmas card of some sort. You know, one of those sort of classic Christmas cards you can find in Clinton's Cards or one of those places. And he would sort of dress it up to give some sort of archaeological reference to it. And this is one that he sent Mick in the early 1980s. And it's a sort of classic Christmassy northern German scene, I suppose. And James has inserted these captions, which says, "When I grow up, Dad, I'm going to clear all these trees away, lay out some fields in strips, and turn this into a large nucleated settlement." And the guy down here is saying assarts, which is not a swear word. In fact, it's a medieval term for clearance of woodland. And really, it was this postcard, in a nutshell, that Mick saw as being the research agenda for Shapwick. This is what it was all about. That Christmas, all of that work came together, all of the past research, all of his network of contacts and friends, and perhaps having some lieutenants who would help him out with the project, like me and Teresa, and we began to then embark on the work at Shapwick. Shapwick is, and you won't be able to see this, a parish. Mick was keen to do a parish study at scale, not to do a particular study of an occupied village, which is the kind of work that Carenza is going to be talking about in a moment. So this is slightly different. He wanted to do something which would look at the long term. He didn't just want to look at medieval. He wanted to look at all the prehistory, right up to the present day. And he wanted to involve local communities and some of the local landowners. Shapwick is down more or less in the middle of Somerset, between Bridgewater and Glastonbury. And the key point to grasp about Shapwick is that in the Middle Ages, this was a manor that belonged to Glastonbury Abbey, which is an extremely wealthy Benedictine house not far away. And so the lords and masters of this place were the monastery. So we kind of combined two of Mick's interests here: monasteries in the landscape and settlement studies. Shapwick had already been the scene of previous archaeological work, because this is the area that John and Bryony Coles worked when they were excavating the Sweet Track down on the Somerset levels, those fantastic wooden walkways which they excavated in the 1970s. We didn't intend to work in that part of the parish, but Mick thought it was very useful because the people in the parish had a tradition of working with archaeologists, that they would put up with us, that there were campsites which were appropriate, pubs which would take large numbers of archaeologists, and that this had all been nicely primed by John and Bryony in the 1970s, and we could kind of step in and carry on the tradition there in Shapwick. Well, I have to say, Shapwick is a very interesting part of the world to work in. There are one or two key dangers, and the main one is this: scrumpy. You don't want to put 120 students in the immediate vicinity of a large number of public houses selling cheap scrumpy. Piece of advice there. But we did have great facilities. We even had ice cream vans which came directly to the edges of the trench, with an audience there of purchasers who were keen to buy. We had some remarkable evenings out in the local pubs, which Kerry will remember. Line dancing is a very They're very keen. They're very keen on line dancing in Somerset. Line dancing with a twist, I have to say. This particular band, who are warming up here, had a version of Deep Purple songs, which is not to be forgotten, which they would play as line dancing tunes. Quite remarkable. Hence the grimace here on the face of the student. And that area is also very well known for its cheese. And I'll just recall one anecdote for you. On one occasion, Mick and I were standing in a field with lots of students talking about the archaeology, and we could hear sirens coming across the levels, 2 police cars moving very quickly towards Shapwick, and they bumped into the field over the ridge and furrow, and 2 officers got out. Mick and I looked at each other, walked towards the officers, and one of them held out his hand, and he said, "Good afternoon." And he said, "Good afternoon." He said, "I'm afraid, sirs, I have to report to you there's been a dairy-related incident." And Mick and I looked at each other, and it was, that film Hot Fuzz, which was one of Mick's favourite films. You had to bite your lip there. But it turned out that somebody had stolen 6,000 gallons of liquid cheese from a truck which was parked in a lay-by just outside Shapwick. And the local constabulary had decided that the students were very probably responsible for this. And they asked for our permission. It seems scarcely credible now, but they asked for our permission to search the campsite where the students were staying, looking for bottles of cheese or cheese stored under sleeping bags. I was never quite sure how you could conceal 6,000. It was probably half of this room we're talking about, that kind of volume. Tremendous. But they didn't. So they went, but they didn't find any cheese. We were innocent. But we did see later on the cheese truck, which was still parked up and had been abandoned by its owners, who were Dairy Lee. You know that company? And it had Dairy Lee written on the side, big capital D. The whole of the D had been cut out with a torch, with an acetylene torch. 2-meter wide hole cut in the side of this thing, and they'd siphoned out all of this liquid cheese. And obviously, Mick and I were kind of, the likely lads who were going to be responsible for this. What can you say? Anyway, innocent we were. We not, Kerry? Okay, so Shapwick then combined together Mick's academic interest with his commitment to public archaeology. And this meant that we were keen from the start to involve the local community, to involve local archaeological societies, and to involve local schools. We also went to the village fete, which those of you who live and work in England will know is an important point of communication with local villagers. And so we would turn up there, eat large quantities of Victoria sponge cake, and explain what we've been doing. And we produced every year a booklet and a newsletter which went out to all the people who lived in Shapwick and further afield to explain the results of the previous year. We did quite a lot of media work, and we did lots and lots of site tours of the type that Dave has set up for us to go and have a look at the dig out here. And we had a lot of visitors. I mean, over 10 years, which this project ran, there were 2,300 people involved with the digging. Really very, very large numbers of people. And I hate to think how many visitors, but probably 10,000 or more. It was extremely significant for the archaeology in the local area. This is Chris Gaffney, who was responsible for the geophysics, and Mick, of course, very keen, as we've already heard, on working with schools. And lots of schools came, visited the site, they worked on the site with us, excavating, and they also undertook some of the other activities, of which geophysics was one. And this is Chris Gaffney and his detector van. This is a photo by Mick. So, 10 years work. Where do you begin if you're trying to answer these questions about settlement and landscape? How do you begin? The first thing that we did was to gather together all of the existing information from sites and monuments records and record offices and draw it all together into a single pot. And Mick did the vast majority of that work, and he did it between the times when he was working on Timeteam. Certainly in the early years of Timeteam, in the early part of the 1990s. Mick would go to the local record office. He would make copies of all the Shapwick maps. There are lots of Shapwick maps because the two landowners in Shapwick didn't get on, and they involved lawyers. And lawyers like to draw maps because they're paid by the hour. And that's what we ended up with. Lots of maps, particularly for the 18th, 19th centuries. And again, you won't be able to see this, I'm afraid. We did a lot of work at examining the impartment of the village, the later changes to the village in the 18th and 19th centuries, which were revealed through Mick's work with the maps. We also worked with the maps to look at field boundaries. This is something that hasn't been done very much, actually, in British archaeology. But Mick plotted most of the area of the polders and looked at the different alignments of the field boundaries and observed that there were blocks of field boundaries and fields with certain alignments. And then we would go to farmers and ask if we could dig holes through their field boundaries to try to date them. And this was a program of investigation which we ran over 2 or 3 years. So our aim really was to try to look at when these villages and when these fields might have been set out either side of Shapwick. And we did get some very interesting results, finding that some of these boundaries were Bronze Age in date, others of them are Roman in date, and some of them are a little bit later medieval and early post-medieval. So we were really looking at scale, at trying to understand how the landscape had evolved over a long period of time. Mick, as we've already heard, was good at plotting earthworks and an excellent artist. And he went out to the sites in Shapwick and did plots of the various kinds, working with students, sometimes working with the Royal Commission on historical monuments, and sometimes working with James Bond. This is James Bond's, it's actually rather a fabulous earthwork survey that James did, trying to pinpoint some of the archaeology as a target for some of our trenches. We borrowed helicopters from time to time. I think there were occasions when there were Timeteam helicopters involved. There were certainly time traveller helicopters involved, looking at some of the Shapwick sites. Mick went up and did flights in Cessnas and also used microlights to take photographs of the different sorts of archaeology of different periods. And slowly, bit by bit, over the years, we began to pinpoint some of the sites that we would later be interested in for excavation. In particular, we did lots and lots of field walking, and Mick and Teresa organised this over a number of years, meeting on Thursday mornings outside the post office, gathering together the volunteers who were there and organising fields which could be walked, and then systematically walking them. And Mick walked these at 25-metre intervals, 25 metres apart, 25-metre lengths. This figure of 25, he told me, he'd chosen because it was too far apart for people to talk to each other while they were walking. Otherwise, people chat the whole time while they're walking through the field. So that was the distance. And we walked 800 kilometres in total. Absolutely one of the most intensive pieces of field walking I think probably ever done on a parish, collecting everything, absolutely everything from modern barbed wire back to Mesolithic flint. And once it had been collected in bags, it was brought back to one of the cottages which was lent to us by the Shapwick estate, and washed there, and then taken to Winchester, which is where I was based at that time. And this is me looking rather depressed at the large number of boxes coming in from back of Mick's van. And then students here helping to quantify and identify some of the finds. And if I tell you that sort of right to left, this student is a lecturer, this one works for Historic England, and this one runs a commercial archaeological unit in the south of England. It just goes to show you the kind of impact that I guess Shapwick and these big long-term landscape archaeology projects can have on future generations. And Shapwick was certainly that. So using this data from the field walking, we were able to plot up, in this case, I've shown you some prehistory, which Mick was equally interested in, all of the flints of different periods here, from the Mesolithic all the way through to later Bronze Age, looking at shifting patterns of prehistoric settlement just up on the edge of the Polden Hills where Shapwick is, above the levels. So what we were finding as part of the Shapwick project was some of the settlements which were associated with the work that John Coles and Bryony Coles had done 20 years previously. Where we couldn't field walk, we undertook shovel pit testing. This is a largely American technique, which wasn't very popular, I think, for the most part with the volunteers, but was popular with the students, and involved sieving buckets of soil, topsoil, on a grid, expanding your way over across the pasture in areas which you couldn't field walk. And we did get some interesting results from this kind of work. It's one technique which isn't used overly much, I think, and could be used rather more. Mick referred to them as the buildings people. Actually, they were the Somerset vernacular buildings group, and they did all the work at Shapwick, looking at all the occupied buildings. So they went into everybody's houses, everybody's bedrooms, produced plans of all of the houses, tried to date them, in many cases using dendrochronology or particularly well-dated architectural features. So we examined every house and made some remarkable discoveries, people living in what turned out to be largely 14th century buildings that were completely undiscovered and unlisted at the time. So while the fieldwork was going on, there were people working on the buildings and on the finds, and Mick was continuing to work with Teresa and others on some of the record office evidence. And in particular, they produced this remarkable map, which was really one of the keys to the work that we did at Shapwick. There are no medieval maps for Shapwick, but there are things called terriers, which are not the small dogs, but these are long lists of fields with their owners and their occupiers, which you can use to recreate a map of Shapwick, in this case a map at 1515. And this map has all the field names on it in their correct position. So it's a map that would be recognized in the beginning of the 16th century, but many of these field names have changed over time. But many of them are extremely important. So over here we have the field name Abchester, which is a classic indication of a Roman site. That Chester part of the field name is a good indication of Roman archaeology. Chestal here, which again turned out to be a Roman site. And this field here, which is called Langenworthy, which had been shortened over the time to Enworthy and was now called by the farmer Henry. And this name, Henry, Enworthy, Langenworthy, is an indication of an early medieval farmstead, some kind of enclosure, some kind of settlement, which of course is in this case out in the open fields in the later medieval period, and is an indication that there must be early medieval archaeology there. So this was the pre-Shapwick phases of settlement that we were beginning to uncover through this kind of detective work. We were also able to use that to map out life in the 16th century a little bit. So this is John Pitt. We know where John Pitt lived in the village, and we now know each one of his holdings. And so by putting this information together, you can begin to understand the way that John Pitt lived his life, the different places in the parish that he visited, and it gives you a sort of experiential view of the daily life of a Shapwick parishioner. And we were quite interested in this kind of reconstruction, this kind of detail, which again hasn't been done very often before. Geophys, we've already heard something about that. Here's Chris Gaffney. Julian has mentioned the school for the visually impaired students and some of the Geophys plots, which we undertook this work and survey over the top of the sites which have been identified by Mick through the map work which had been done. We also had geochemistry, and the geochemistry was a bit of a saga, really. What we were interested in here was trying to map out some of the differences in chemistry in the soil. And on occasions, this can lead you to identify where archaeology lies under the ground. And Mick worked with a chemist and botanist called Mike Martin, and they decided that the best way of gathering this information, wait for it, was to look at woodlice. By gathering up woodlice in the fields and processing them, in inverted commas, you could see all of the heavy metals which these woodlice have picked up in their travels. And woodlice don't travel very far. So by plotting, using the woodlice, if you know where you've picked them up, you can plot the chemistry under the ground in any field. And we tried this, and what we found was that the woodlice were mainly picking up lead from people's tractors and cars. So that we abandoned that idea, and we went back to a more manual scheme of gridding out fields, taking samples of soil, and then Andrew Jackson did a PhD working to try to see what all of this meant. And we got some fabulous results from it. This is a plot of field 4016, which is called Church Field. This is the church in blue, and all of this sort of staining in the field here, which has been overlaid on top of the field, is the high percentage of heavy metals in and around the church. Effectively, it gives you a map of what's under the ground. And of course, you can complement that with your geophysics and your map work to begin to build up a picture of what's going on. And this is one of our many, many, many discussions which took place over the course of the summers. Teresa at the end there, was Mick and I, Andrew Jackson and Mike Martin. Mick was very keen on the idea of working with heavy metals. I think the idea of heavy metal really appealed to him, you know, with his interest in Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin, that kind of thing. But he also, in truth, I don't think I could say this if he was here, because he really liked the idea of the Aston Martin technique. I don't think anybody else picked up on that. We also did a great deal of work on hedgerows, and we had people from the extramural department in Bristol, David Hill and Maggie Williams, did an extraordinary job plotting out all the species in all the hedgerows in Shapwick, looking at concentrations of different types of plants, in this case wayfaring trees, to try to see if it meant anything. Mick was trying to test out this idea, which appeared on one or two Timeteam programs actually, that by counting species in hedgerows, you could get some idea as to what their date might be. It didn't work at Shapwick, I have to say, but we did end up with some very curious patterns. And what Mick was always keen to say about Shapwick was that this was a sort of laboratory. The way that he described it was like Timeteam on acid. You know, we were just doing very similar things to what was happening in those 3-day stretches of Timeteam programs, but at scale. We also did invertebrate surveys. I don't think that ever happened on a Timeteam program, sadly. This involves working with invertebrate specialists, people interested in things like hoverflies and beetles. And what they do is they take those leaf blowers and they invert the motor so that they suck rather than blow. And they work their way along the leaf litter at the base of a hedge and drag everything into a big basket. And then they go through it and identify all the beetles and all the flies and then put the whole lot back in the hedgerow again. Meanwhile, you have somebody beating the hedges with a little stick and popping them into one of these little woven bags, and again, identifying everything you can find in the hedgerow. And what we were interested in doing here was to see if there was a technique that we could develop at Shapwick, which would be that perhaps the diversity or the number of invertebrate species in the hedge would be an indication as to the date of the hedge. And we found that it worked. And again, this is something that has not really been taken up since Shapwick finished, 5 years ago. But I do think it's a technique which has significant potential, looking at landscapes and at historical ecology. So this kind of map-based approach, rather a GIS sort of approach as you might recognize it today, involved overlaying all of this data. So we had earthwork surveys, we had plots from aerial photographs, we have field walking data, we had Andrew Jackson, his geochemistry, and on the basis of these plots, we opened out trenches. And my job each year for eight weeks of the year was to open up a number of trenches. I think we did about 90 to 100 trenches at Shapwick overall, looking at over 40 different sites. And in the village, where we weren't going to be digging, we did test pitting, which I know is something that Karenza's going to be, and Teresa's going to be talking about next. But at Shapwick, we tried this out, taking the methodology from the work which was being developed through the commercial units like Wessex and Cotswold and Oxford, working at commercial sites, and we applied it to occupied villages. So we dug these small holes in a pattern all the way through the village, from the topsoil right the way down to the top of bedrock. And this is Mike Coston, another person who was very important in the work at Shapwick, proudly looking down on a 1 by 1 meter hole. And this was the basis, if you recall, of the Big Dig, wasn't it? This idea that we could do this over the whole country in different areas. So we were really, in this case, preceding the work that Timeteam did, and in other cases we were slightly lagging behind it at Shapwick. But it was in a sense, the two were always linked. When Mick came back from Timeteam filming, he would talk to the students. He would help me organise some of the landowners who did or didn't want us to work on his land. And of course, he would network into people working on the Somerset levels. Steve Minnett down here has already been mentioned, who was at Taunton Museum in Somerset. And he would sit in the van, visit the sites, mark theses, mark bits of work, look at Timeteam information, revise for the next episode, and then get in the van and head off to the next piece of filming. So we would often hear about Timeteam antics on the excavation and what had been happening there. The other thing about Shapwick was that we combined the training excavation, about 100 students, with commercial archaeology and volunteers. So we brought all of those things together. And these three things had been very much separated up until that point. We tried to mix community volunteers with university students. We had a strong program of environmental work. I think this is Kerry down here, Kerry, in your moat. No, you were no younger. You were no younger. And here is Mick after he was laid up, having fallen down his holy well in North Wales, watching the excavations happening. This is, I think, there are 250,000 finds from Shapwick. It took 13 years to get those finds, specialist reports done. This is, I think, my favourite find. It's a cross holder made in Ireland, 12th century, with little beasts' heads here, and it would have held a cross and sat on an altar. And it probably comes from one of the churches associated with Glastonbury. The remarkable thing about it is that it's found in an 18th century context, and in the jaws of this medieval cross holder is a Bronze Age blade. So this and this are nearly 2,500 years apart, and it's found in an 18th century context. So it's a curio, a kind of sort of thing you might find in a curiosity cabinet in the 18th century. Quite a remarkable thing. Some large-scale excavations, particularly looking at the early medieval archaeology, mainly earth-fast structures, not really the sort of thing that you have out here. These were very large timber buildings, which we were able to radiocarbon date. This one is beginning of the 8th century, end of the 7th, beginning of the 8th century. And what were our conclusions? Well, what Shapwick told us, particularly from the map work that Mick and Teresa had done, was that in the early medieval period, there was a dispersed pattern of settlement which existed over the whole parish. And then once we moved into the 10th century, it would seem that the modern day village came into existence, and that this was a purposeful decision, perhaps taken by the monastery at Glastonbury, a decision which was perhaps taken because it would improve their profits on this land from the work that they could do on the new open field system, laying out the fields either side, give them higher yields, higher profits, and better organise the workforce. And this is one of Victor Ambros's fabulous reconstructions, which are in the Shapwick volume, which he did for every period of the Shapwick book, showing in the 10th century people removing their houses and taking the timbers off to reconstruct them in what would become the new Shapwick village. We published a book which is outside, which is, I think, to be honest, one of the best things I've ever done, and I know that Mick was very pleased with it when it came out. This is the cover that you will see on the book. This is the cover that you could have had, which you can probably make out is Mick's left knee. For some reason, I'm not really quite sure why, we did play with the idea of using Mick's left knee on the cover. And I really can't remember why that was the case. But anyway, when it was suggested to the publisher, they said, no. So we said, okay, we'll do something else then. Anyway, there we are. So I have 30, 40 pictures of Mick's left knee as a result of this exercise. Very fine it is too. And here is Mick in Durham, which is my university, where a lot of the post-excavation work was finally completed and the book was put together. I think he would look back on the Shapwick project with pride. I hope he would. I think it's been influential in what other people have done, particularly actually in its methodologies. And I think we all made a lot of new friends while we were there. And I certainly did. So thank you.
Chris is happy to take questions, so do have a think about what you would like to ask him. There's a question that I'd always wanted to ask Mick and didn't really have the courage to do so, but I think I can ask you. What was it for? What was the project for?
The project was, in a nutshell, was to work out the origins of the English village. Why is it that we end up with that very curious pattern of villages from north to south, from this part of the world all the way down into Devon? Why do villages exist there and they don't exist elsewhere? Fundamentally, that was what he wanted to answer. And the answer to that question, as far as Shapwick's concerned, of course, Shapwick is only one case study, and work that's gone on since provides alternative explanations. But our view, when we concluded the volume, was that this was the product of deliberate decisions taken by powerful people who were deciding where people were going to be living and how they were going to be living and what they were going to be doing. So this is the feudal system in operation, if you like. And that was fundamentally the contribution that the monastery at Glastonbury, and particularly one abbot, perhaps Abbot Dunstan, could have been personally involved in changing the whole habitat, really, of the way that people lived at that period in that area.
Thank you. Anyone else got a question?
Silence.
Jeez. Yes, a young lad down the front.
Yeah.
Hang on, we'll use the mics again so that the people who are listening and watching
the troublesome
online
Julian Richards has a question.
Yeah.
Yes. Chris, you've just said that it was a lot to do with the monastery. Do you now not need to go and start another project on a village that wasn't under monastic influence to see what the contrast is between the two?
The thing is, 25 years.
Oh, come on, you're a young man.
It's going to be tight, I think. I mean, there's no doubt it needs to be done. And I think one could bring to bear other methodologies. I mean, particularly some of the things we've already been hearing about. You know, work with drones makes the aerial photography a lot easier than it was back in our day. Work with GIS makes the approach that we use, this kind of multi-layered approach to looking at the landscape. All of that could be done a lot more easily than it could be done in our day, when it was more a question of Mick with a drawing board and a glass of French wine. And so I would be enthusiastic to see that kind of project. One of the issues, Julian, is where are you going to get the money from to make that kind of project happen over a 10-year lifespan? And even a big EU project, were we ever to get EU money again, would be hard-pressed to find the money to fund the post-X for that, which was entirely funded, in fact, by English Heritage. The work itself on site was all done free of charge by volunteer groups. But of course, you end up with a room a third of this size full of boxes, which needs to be processed. And that's where the cost lies. And then you need to employ specialists. So my worry would be the time commitment, very long-term projects. University staff struggle these days to make that sort of commitment over a 20-year period, and the money for the post-excavation. But Heritage Lottery funding, you mentioned, would certainly be a possibility. And above all, you would need a landowner who was committed to let you have access, which we had here in Lord Vestey, who Dewhurst the butchers. It's ironic, really, given Mick's vegetarian stance. But Dewhurst the butchers were the landowner, and that enabled us, really, through one single permission, to get access to much of the land. And that is very time-consuming, as you know. So I think a difficult thing for somebody to take on, but not impossible, particularly if the community was committed to doing it. I mean, an island like this, for example, the kind of archaeology which is being done here is surely getting close to that sort of work, funded through a completely different mechanism. Yeah.
Anybody else? Lady there? And there's a gentleman on the other side. About halfway down.
Thank you. In view of what was mentioned earlier about museums having or refusing to take things from digs and what have you, what's happened to the finds from Shapwick?
So in the case of our local museum, which would in this case be Somerset Taunton Museum, they have a very clear policy on finds that they will accept and those that they'll not accept. So in the case of all of the diagnostic finds, they took all of those. That's to say, all of the pottery, all of the dress accessories and metalwork. But other finds like brick and tile, we were asked to make a kind of type series, a selection of what we thought was most suitable, which would reflect the range of material. And that meant that a considerable volume of the bulk was discarded. I'm in favour of that approach. I think the difficulties for me arise where perhaps museums and local curators are not quite sure what you should be keeping. But in the case of Somerset, the policy was very clear and we did what we were asked. And that's where all the material is now stored, including other material which was found at Shapwick. As you may know, one of the biggest finds at Shapwick was a very large coin hoard, which maybe Helen will be touching upon tomorrow, which really brought Mick in touch with metal detectorists and was significant in terms of forming his views about what should happen with that kind of material. So everything from Shapwick, both from the project and from other interventions there, is stored there. I think it's sensible. I think it's a good approach, yeah.
Can I ask you a subsidiary question on that? You said that a lot of the roof tile and that kind of stuff was, and the word you used was discarded.
Yeah.
70 years ago, if we had done an excavation and there were loads and loads of bones in it, there wouldn't have been any interest in those bones because it would have been thought that there wasn't anything to be read from them. And then we began to learn how to interpret the various illnesses and the age and the sex from those bones. And latterly, with DNA, they've now become some of the most valuable finds that you can get on many sites. I'd have thought it's at least possible to argue that things like tile may have a significant importance to people in the future. When you say discarded, do you really mean that they were ground up and cast to the wind, or were they buried in somewhere where they're recorded so people get access to them in the future?
No, they've been discarded. They're in landfill. Of course, I mean, I also work in other countries, and it would be completely unacceptable in those countries to discard anything from an archaeological site. You wouldn't get permission to do so. The case in Shapwick is that we would have had, I'm going to say, 300 boxes of 19th century tile, most of which can be seen on the roofs of people's houses in Shapwick. And although, you know, perhaps useful for repairs and DIY, it's not a dwindling resource. And I suppose that many, particularly 10 years ago, many, and today perhaps, many county museums simply have to take a decision based on the amount of space that they have and what their priorities are. That's realistically the world that we live in. The Somerset Museum would not have accepted all of the finds from Shapwick. There's no doubt about it. Finding an alternative, I think it would need to be local to the area, not in the northeast, for example, where I'm based, and perhaps reburial on site would have been the best alternative there. And that's certainly something that I've done in relation to another project that I'm involved with in Wiltshire. But that didn't happen in this case.
Gentleman down there.
You come up with a hypothesis for why these villages existed in that north-south strip.
I mean, other people have worked on this since, and I'm particularly keen on the explanation that the soils and the geology, because that very much mirrors the geology map of Britain, actually, that north-south strip of the heavier soils. And I do wonder whether the explanation which is currently being put forward isn't the right one, which is that if you have very heavy soils, then you need large plough teams to pull the ploughs. That requires organisation. And the best way to get everybody in this room to work together as a community to plough the fields so that we can overcome bad harvests and stay alive with our families year after year, is to get us to work together, is to put us in one place. If we all live together, we're easier to organise. And I think that's what the decision there is about. So I think it's something to do with particular kinds of geology, particular kinds of soils, perhaps also reflected in particular types of land holdings by some of the large monasteries, some of the more powerful monasteries, which had a particularly a strong grip on their tenants. And were able to take these decisions really at will. And I suspect that's perhaps where Abbot Dunstan was involved at Glastonbury in taking decisions about what would happen at Shapwick and many other places in that particular area. But this, like so much in archaeology, is an ongoing debate. And you know, the work that Karenza is going to be talking about later, the work that Teresa is going to be talking about in a moment, will all feed into this pot. And I think we're all used to archaeologists to the idea that we don't have a single answer to that question. It's changed very much in our academic lifetimes over the last 30 years. What I was taught by Mick is not what I'm telling you. And archaeology moves in that way. So we always have things to learn, and there are always possibilities that new projects will come up with new data.
Thank you. Time has defeated us. Can you give a big hand to Chris Gerrard?